Thanks a lot for attending. We're going to present this together, and the title of our presentation is Creative Construction, Bridging Theory and Practice, and it picks up on the title of a book that Christoph and I edited that was published at the beginning of the year. This is what it looks like. The title is Creative Construction, Democratic Planning in the 21st Century and Beyond. And we used parts of the introduction in the book to outline some aspects of our understanding of this notion of creative construction, which of course is also a playful pun in the direction of the infamous creative destruction heralded by Schumpeter and others. However, it is not only a playful pun, but also an alternative imaginary, an alternative to the idea that there would need to be cycles of socially devastating destruction to bring about the new. In that sense, the notion of creative construction holds a promise that a conscious and collective coordination of our societies is indeed possible. So the introduction in our book only briefly sketches what creative construction could mean. It highlights a certain temporality and processual nature entailed in this notion of creative construction, and a call for engaging in some form of socialist construction that goes beyond critique. This leaves the whole thing still a very kind of undefined or underdefined, which is why we wanted to use this presentation to give it a little bit more substance and discuss with you whether or not this notion of creative construction is worth pursuing further, and if it might be a fruitful addition to our toolbox of concepts within the planning field. So what we will do is to give you a couple of examples that should illustrate how the notion of creative construction can help us address important aspects that are not entirely covered by, for example, the notion of planning, but that in turn are indeed very much needed and of relevance for democratic planning as such, not just for the debate around democratic planning, but for the actual practice of democratic planning as we envision it. So these are the 4 points we would like to address: building bridges, organization of ecology, the model as process, and then finally planning as a discovery mechanism. This is what I hand over to Christoph.
I'm going to build the bridges. So we had this metaphor in the book, and it was really a bunch of bridges. So the idea was to build bridges between theory and practice. That's a classical one. There was an idea of building bridges between critique and alternatives. And then third, building bridges between the different kinds of alternatives. I'll say what this means in a second, and I'll go through them in turn. There's an old insight from social movement studies. If you read like a meso-history of social movement studies from the last kind of decades, that language that social movement studies uses is we used to have old social movements. They were very hierarchical. Think of classical communist parties, think of classical social democratic parties, national liberation movement, and so on. And related to the fact that they were very relatively coherent, tightly structured, very organized, there's a production of relatively comprehensive ideologies. And then social movement studies argues that ever since the 60s, 70s, we had new social movements. Arguably, they're actually much older, but that's the terminology they use. And those new social movements are much more issue-specific. They're not as vertically organized, they're much more networked. There's the image of the multitude, for instance. You've probably come across that. But there's a notion that this is much more networked, and it's issue-specific. Because of being issue-specific, on organizing on particular themes, the kind of what they call the prognostic framing, the imaginaries of how things could be different, is also much more issue-specific and not as comprehensive. And this fact, this transformation combined with the parallel decline of real socialism leads to a decline of systematic alternatives being articulated and discussed. Just to illustrate what this might look like, if we think about those kind of issue-specific imaginaries, that's my take on Nancy Fraser's idea of capitalism as a social order, as an ensemble of social institutions. There's a bunch of things coming together. It's not just private property. You're welcome to define capitalism differently, but just to illustrate this point, I think I have to stay with the mic so it gets recorded. Think of workplace despotism. There's the imaginary that we have workplace democracy, that we decide things democratically in the workplace. Think of the workers being divorced from the means of subsistence. We have imaginaries of UBI, universal basic income, universal basic services, and arguably the foundational economy is closely related to them. A lot of us, that's us, the green things are us. So with the anarchy of the market, we talk about democratic planning, participatory planning as an alternative. Less visible in our space, there's a growing debate on related to the privatization of care and family form that has imaginaries like let's socialize care, communal care, in the words of Helen Lester, more controversial term, family abolition. We talk about the metabolic rift. We have imaginaries of degrowth and eco-socialism. I would argue that the division between economics and politics, that's also us. How does the political community relate to the economic sphere? And then we have interstate, if we move from the anarchy of the market to the anarchy of the interstate system, we have imaginaries of a new international economic order. Think of discussions about global reparations, or also taking up again all the debate from the 70s, 80s, what would delinking mean today from the world system? Finally, racism, we have imaginaries of reparations as well in a different kind. Prison abolition has been popular imaginary ever since Black Lives Matter, and so on and so forth. This is not a comprehensive list, but this is just to illustrate that those imaginaries are more issue specific. It's less, let's have communism, it's more concrete images of a piece of the puzzle. So a potential synthesis of building bridges there could be to think about, to revisit more systematic alternatives, which is a lot of what is like. Think about what a coherent alternative to capitalism would look like, that encompasses many more elements than planning. But also, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, they say, I think. Probably did some vaguely like that. And let's keep the good things that the new social movements raised a lot of voices that were silenced before. So let's think about gender, sexuality, race, imperialism, ecology. A lot of the issues that came up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then let's integrate those imaginaries. Okay, I think that's where I pass the mic back.
Yes, thanks a lot. And very much in this spirit of building bridges, but with a slightly broader agenda, creative construction can also serve as a collective social imaginary that builds bridges between these different actors that Christoph was just talking about, between these different actors within a larger organizational ecology of alternatives to capitalism. And such a collective social imaginary can provide guiding principles that are both broad enough to bring together a diverse set of social actors, while at the same time providing enough cohesive power to enable a common focus on shared broader goals, which is also, of course, necessary. So it thereby not only fulfills a bridging function, but also creates a rough sense of shared orientation in relation to the processes of collective experimentation that necessarily have to take place. And I would like to highlight an insight by David Leitman with regard to the role of consensualization that is entailed in this bringing together. So the quote is, I have put forward the idea that systematization, creating of a consistent set of production and allocation activities in both capitalist and socialist contexts is in fact not the main aim of the respective primary systematization mechanisms of each mode of production, the market and coordination, respectively. The primary goals of these mechanisms are valorization in capitalist societies and consensualization in socialist ones. End quote. So this is, I think, a very important and quite deep insight, arguably, in the overall picture, including outcome in a more narrow sense. It is more efficient to have a coordination mechanism that is effective in consensualization than to have a pseudo-efficient mechanism that fails to produce meaningful consensualization. This does not mean that everybody should have to agree in the end, but what it means is that in order for comprehensive democratic planning to function, there needs to be a rough sense of shared directionality in place, one might say an ethos of collective creative construction. So in our introduction, we argue that creative construction is creative in the sense that it understands the collective construction of alternatives as a continuous process, a continuous search, and I would like to add to this processual aspect of the term. Within the newer planning debate, there has been a renewed engagement with a canon of models of comprehensive democratic planning. Most of us here know about these models. More recently, there has been a very welcome call brought forward by Sophie and Simon to develop a modular understanding of how to approach the task that these models try to fulfill. Now, creative construction proposes a processual understanding of models of democratic planning that sees the model itself as a process. It argues that instead of sketching an ideal state sometime in the future and remaining silent about the process of transition into said future, any model for democratic planning should inscribe a processual logic of transition into the way the model itself is set up. This crucially shifts how to think about the relation between the model and the actual present. Instead of framing it as a gap to be bridged between a sketched-out future and an imperfect present, it urges us to think of the model itself as a process of transition that starts in the present. On the one hand, this means that an important starting point will always have to be the question of how the already existing diverse ecology of different initiatives, movements, individuals, and groups of all sizes that are practicing alternative economic relations in multiple ways in the here and now can be brought into a position from which they can engage in forms of collective coordination and planning between each other. On the other hand, it follows that only a highly modular approach provides the necessary variety and adaptability to incorporate such a diverse starting point. And this processual understanding of modularity, however, has a slightly different emphasis compared to what Sophie and Simon described recently. It includes what you are sketching out, which means we can have a sort of division of labor and looking at specific aspects of these models. But it also argues that there needs to be a highly adaptable framework that is able to accommodate this huge variety of alternatives to capitalism that is present in our times and from which we will have to start. So this is a slightly different emphasis, and it adds something to it. So the fourth point we have is planning as a discovery mechanism, and for democratic planning to work, there is a central need to address and frankly activate and make sense and make use of a realm that goes beyond codified statistical knowledge. And this again has many layers to it, of course. Famously, the topic of tacit knowledge has been discussed within the planning debate quite a bit. And another layer that was mentioned already in our presentation is that of social imaginaries. And what I would like to highlight here under the rubric planning as a discovery mechanism is something different though. It pertains to the question of how the production of the new is brought about within a democratic planned economy. However, it is quite telling, I would argue, I'm not sure if Christoph agrees, but I guess, hopefully, I would argue that it is telling that calling planning as a discovery mechanism somewhat doesn't really sit right. It would maybe be more precise to speak of planning for discovery mechanisms, which would demarcate that what the processes are that bring about the new can never be fully determined, never be fully planned. Or, you might have guessed it, one might speak of planning for creative construction. Creative construction understood here as a process and realm of experimentation and innovation. And while democratic planning might work as an overarching umbrella, the process as such, as it is closely tied to forms of experimentation and discovery, is better described as a process of creative construction. Thanks.
That's right. I'll just hand over to you. we came up with an additional thing yesterday that I wanted to add here, because there's another element to this discovery process, essentially relating to what Jan already said about conceptualization, and also relating to Fikret's presentation yesterday and a lot of the stuff that Aaron is doing. I think the idea that well-designed democratic decision protocols enable us to discover agreements and disagreements we might have, other lived realities, value systems, which might mean, in a logic of deliberative democracy, that might mean that we get to change our opinion, but it also might mean that we continue to disagree, but we understand each other better. But most importantly, it means that the decision-making process creates a form of social legitimacy, even when you do not reach consensus, however often. Okay, so to wrap up, Creative destruction, creative construction. This is like the secret market socialism. Sometimes I have to continuously fight it when I'm here. Creative construction is an undogmatic and open invitation to anybody who is interested in bringing up structural change towards desirable alternatives to capitalism. It provides a framework for bringing together different theoretical approaches as well as practitioners within an organizational ecology interested in bringing about structural change towards democratically planned post-capitalism. As such, creative construction is as much social imaginary as it is a call to collectively fill this imaginary. And with this invitation, we would like to thank you for